and welcome to the Wellness with Juanita Podcast. I'm your host, Juanita Nagai, an American living in Japan for 20 years. I've gone through some massive life changes and crises in my 20 years here. At its bleakest, I felt very isolated, alone, and helpless in the face of what was happening. I relied on alcohol and cigarettes to get through it the best I knew how, which worked until it didn't, and everything fell apart. I made it through with a little help from my friends, a fledgling mindfulness practice, and learning how to become my own strongest ally. I quit drinking and smoking, worked my way through my grief, found ways to forgive, created new connections, and started a regular exercise, meditation, and self-care routine. I've also become a national board certified health and wellness coach along the way, and developed a desire and passion to help others on their own personal journeys. This podcast is all about change, growth, healing yourself, learning how to get back up after life kicks you down, and exploring mindfulness and self-compassion as incredible tools available to each and every one of us to do just that. Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the Wellness with Juanita podcast. I'm your host, Juanita Nagai, an American living in Japan for 20 years and a nationally board certified health and wellness coach. For my first episode, I was thinking that it makes a lot of sense to introduce my listeners to my story and explain why I am sitting before you today, and just give you a little bit of background about what led me to be where I am. It also seems like a really appropriate time to be launching a new podcast and to be reflecting on my story, as it were, because I know it's the 5-year anniversary of when I actually started putting my practice into an actual practice. I had started reading a lot of books and maybe even listening to podcasts at that point, but I can't quite remember. But I basically was kind of emerging out the other end of the tunnel of grief and rage and resentment and a lot of really strong emotions that basically overtook me and my life after my mother passed away suddenly in early December of 2017 at the age of 60. And I was just completely overwhelmed with the intensity of my grief. So that was a shock. And then just a few months later, my husband decided to take a job in another prefecture, which effectively made me a single mother. Our daughter was 4 years old then, and I was basically left at home with this overwhelming grief and our daughter. And I entered into a very dark and kind of rage-filled period of my life, to be totally honest. I seem to have dived right in the deep end, but why not? That's why we're here. So yeah, I had always kind of been a party girl in Japan, and my husband and I met in the bar that he was the manager and bartender at. We had a lot of similar friends, and we just had a really big drinking culture. And so when I was confronted with all of these overwhelming emotions and just such a shock to my system, I kind of immediately turned to alcohol and cigarettes to get me through, because that's what I was doing already anyway, to be totally honest. So I drank a lot. And I remember I would come home from work and pick up my daughter from daycare. And as soon as we got home, she would kind of get set up on YouTube with Paw Patrol or some video. And I would just sit outside and I would chain smoke like 2 or 3 cigarettes and pound 2 or 3 beers just to be able to kind of reset and then be able to go inside and start doing all of the mom stuff, making dinner, bringing in the laundry and everything that needed to be done. I spent all of my planning time at work furiously researching other options. Like, where could we go? What could we do? He was in another prefecture for a year, but we didn't need to stay here. What could we do? Where could we go? And basically, I was just trying to make reality be anything but what it was. My grief from my mom would overtake me at times, and I don't know how else to describe that except to say, like, it was an actual overtaking, almost like a tidal wave. I was unable to deal with it, I think, at all, because I was dealing with the issues and the anger and the hurt that I was feeling towards my husband for choosing to leave me and us at that most vulnerable time and when I felt like I needed him the most. And so it was just a really dark, difficult time in my life. And to say I was stressed or overwhelmed is like laughable. It was beyond that. Physically, obviously, I was drinking to excess literally every single night. I was smoking at least a pack of cigarettes every single day. I was not taking good care of myself at all. I got these kind of balls of stress in my shoulders and my neck. I was so tight and just like balls of fury and stress. I would get these weird throbbing headaches in my left temple that would just come and go. I never was really able to identify what brought them on or why they would leave. I just knew that they would come with regularity quite often at work. And that's the most that I can really kind of verbally describe what the physical manifestations were at that time. But I was just a mess. I was not okay. I felt very, very alone. I didn't know what to do. I think a part of my brain was insisting that there was something that I could do. And yeah, that was my existence for a very long, basically year and a half, until I kind of had my breaking point or turning point. Very specifically, one night out on the deck after my daughter had gone to sleep and I was deep into my bottle of wine and I was just pouring out tears and looking at the stars and missing my mom and just feeling just absolutely wretched and miserable. And I just remember thinking to myself as I looked at the wine glass and the cigarette in my hand and the tears streaming down my face, the thought that just came through really loud and clear was, this is not working for me anymore, if it ever was. Like, whatever I'm doing here, this is not helping. I need something else. I need another way to live and another way to process my grief or another way to be for my daughter, even if just for her sake. And I thought of an online acquaintance who I knew was married to a Buddhist Zen monk up north in Japan, and she herself is a mindfulness meditation teacher. And I drunkenly, but luckily, bravely reached out to her and basically just said, "Hey, do you have any book recommendations or names or resources or anything that might help in me starting exploring mindfulness and exploring meditation?" And she gratefully and graciously wrote me back with a list of books and authors, and also some really basic instructions on how to get going on trying meditation. And that was, for me, the turning point. And I won't lie and say that from there on in, I stopped drinking and smoking and it was all smooth sailing, because it definitely was not. And it was a very long, hard process. But that was the turning point for me. What happened next is that I started reading those books and I started getting more interested and I started exploring things. And it was all fascinating and it was all really up my alley. And some of the people that she recommended to me then have become some of my favorite teachers now. Names like Tara Brach and Jack Kornfield and Ram Dass, Thich Nhat Hanh, who I had heard of. I think I read Thich Nhat Hanh and Ram Dass in high school, but never really got into as much as I did during that period. But, I would, again, on the way home from work, my daughter was still in daycare at this point, and she didn't want me to come get her before 5 o'clock because she wanted to play outside. So I would get off the train at this certain stop early so that I could sit at their convenient and pleasant benches and their little open space area right in front of the station. And I'd sit there and I'd smoke my cigarettes and I'd read books by Ram Dass about meditating. And at a certain point, it just, occurred to me that I needed to actually do this stuff. Like, I wasn't going to get the full range of benefits or any at all by just reading books. Like, if I really was curious, the best way to try it out was to do it for myself. And so I did start experimenting with simple sitting meditations and concentrating on my own breath just for like 5 minutes at a time. Again, I was still drinking and I was still smoking and I was still struggling with all of these really big emotions. But I think what happened was that I wasn't able to experiment or play around with meditation until after my daughter was asleep. And I didn't want to meditate after I had been drinking. So eventually it was like, well, I can't drink tonight. I can't come home and go immediately to the beer or the wine, because I want to try and meditate later on tonight. And so it became a way for me to slowly stop drinking as much. And then my husband came back to live with us. The work that he had taken finished up and he came back. And so we were all together in our recently purchased house. And we, the three of us, went to the United States back home to visit for 3 weeks. And it was an amazing trip. It was another, I think, page that turned in my book. I was able to reconnect with so many great friends. We traveled through various states, and I just filled up my cup. I was able to visit my mom's grave, and kind of decorate it, do part of the rituals around grieving that helped me feel closer to her and feel like there was some kind of progression or procession perhaps with my grief. But yeah, it was just a really, really meaningful, wonderful visit. And it felt like, okay, life is now, it was really, really hard, but now I'm moving forward. I'm looking forward. I'm going to take all of this love and connection and positivity and just kind of breathe it all in and carry it with me as far as I can into the next phase of our life back home in Japan. And very, very miraculously, once we returned back to Japan in August, I discovered I was pregnant with a very, very much wanted second child. And very early on into the pregnancy, before I was even sharing with friends or my workplace beyond my boss, I started bleeding and I had issues with the pregnancy, and the doctor ordered me on bed rest. And the story of that pregnancy and all of my experiences, I talked about quite frankly and quite freely on another podcast, a wonderful podcast called Birth Stories Japan. I will put the links and the information to that in the show notes. So if you would like to hear about that experience and that story in more detail, I encourage you to go there. For this podcast and this story, I will just say that I was on 5 weeks of bed rest until I was hospitalized for another 2 weeks. And in the end, we lost the baby. And it was, again, just an incredibly devastating, overwhelming blow. And I was just plunged back into darkness and grief. I had been reading books on grief, tentatively looking towards the grief that I felt towards my mom once we had come back to Japan, and starting to recognize that it was still kind of coming over me in tidal waves, and I would get completely bowled over by it. And so I had started the process of trying to deal with that in small pieces, in small bits as I could, as I felt ready and resourced. And that happened with the baby. And I just remember, I was like, well, now, which one of them do I concentrate on or think of as I'm reading this book on grief? It was so hard all over again. But it was what it was. That is what life had in store for me. And during that time on bed rest, I remember thinking, well, now I have all the time in the world. I could be meditating all day long if I wanted to, because I'm not allowed to do anything but sit here or lay here. But I couldn't. It just wasn't what I needed at that point. And what I needed at that point was to stay distracted and to stay mentally and physically busy as I could. Obviously, I couldn't physically use my whole body, but I started cross-stitching. I was trying to use my hands. I was trying to keep my mind occupied. I watched, a lot of lighthearted comedy shows, things to try and keep my spirits up, because I thought that was the best thing that I could possibly do for the baby. And in the end, nothing mattered, because I lost him anyway. And it was really, really hard. And yeah, that happened. It was a really, really dark couple of years. And I wanted to share something that I recently discovered in my journal from 5 years ago, recognizing that that's when I started experimenting and playing and really getting into things. And also, life happened and the tragedies kind of came one after the other in these waves of me not even being able to catch my breath to try to continue to meditate as a technique for trying to get through my grief or trying to relieve my stress or just get back to myself. It was like one thing after another after another. However, I was curious where I was and what I was feeling 5 years ago that summer. And I recently reread my journal. I discovered, number one, that I did not write at all the year that my husband was away. And number two, I see how the very, very beginnings of my path of turning towards myself and learning how to take care of myself and how to love myself and to give myself what I most needed was just starting to take shape and just starting to form. So I'd like to share this passage because it's a really wonderful snapshot of kind of a then and now. Because I wrote after that wonderful visit home to the US and we came back and I was just filled up with love and kind of positivity and tentative first steps back into my life and where it was headed. I wrote that I want to not drink on school nights and actually quit smoking and exercise and meditate and write and read and create and feel the love and peace of the universe and each and every moment. And it took me quite a while to get there, but I realized that I am doing all of those things that I had said. I quit drinking and I quit smoking and I started exercising and I now have a daily meditation practice. And I also have a regular practice of doing yoga and journaling and other self-care rituals that I need. And if I could look at myself, if 5 years ago me could see where I am now, I think she would be so grateful and so relieved that she really did make it out the other side and that there was a light at the end of the tunnel and that things did change. And so I have created this podcast in the hopes that by sharing my own personal story and experiences, I may inspire or help or inform others that are on their own path, perhaps struggling with their own addictions or overwhelming stress, grief, the strong emotions that can overtake us as we walk down this path that is our own unique life and all of the things that life throws up at us. It's not easy, and none of us escape it. What I think I have learned more than anything is that it is up to us to decide how we want to face it. and how we want to choose to respond to the things that happen to us in our lives. And that 5 years ago, me luckily chose myself and chose looking forward and looking for ways to do things differently and looking for ways to change, because who I was and what I was doing was not helping, and it was hurting me, if anything. But I do believe it's what I needed to do to get through the best that I knew how. And I think that is also the only thing that any of us can ask of ourselves. We do the best that we can with what we have. And there's a wonderful Maya Angelou quote that says, "Do the best that you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better." And I believe that is what we're all doing in our own ways. So what I would like to do to wrap up each podcast, this first one is obviously very personal. I hope that it may have helped even just one person to hear that first part of my story and to hear how I've gone from there to where I am now, a certified health and wellness coach, entrepreneur, launching her own podcast, serving clients individually, working with businesses, and hopefully starting a group as well soon. But what I would like to do at the end of each podcast is to leave you with something that you can take with you. So for today, for this first podcast, I would like to leave you, listener, with the question of what brought you here? What brought you to this podcast today? I've just shared my story with you and what brought me here, but I'd encourage you to reflect on what brought you to me and this podcast. So if you'd like to share any of that, I'd be more than happy to hear. I'd love to hear comments, feedbacks, and if you can spread the love and share the word of this podcast, I would appreciate it so, so much. Until next time, thank you so much for joining me, and take care.